Welcome to the channel. Sometimes dreams are just dreams. And sometimes they're a warning. Do you agree? Today's story is about that. The city of Cincinnati was still half asleep when Michael Reed woke in a cold sweat. His heart hammered against his ribs, and the sound of his own breathing filled the dark, silent room. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. The dream clung to him like static, sharp, lingering, impossible to shake. He reached for the edge of the bed, fingers trembling, and tried to catch his breath. The clock read 4:16 a.m. outside. The world was calm. Inside his mind, it was chaos. He had seen something, a plane, silver against a pale blue sky, banking sharply, unnaturally, before tilting upside down and crashing into the ground. There had been no sound, no scream, no engine noise, only a deep, sickening silence that ended in a flash of white fire. He had woken the moment the explosion hit, as if his body had been torn from another reality. At first, he tried to dismiss it. A nightmare, he told himself. Nothing more. But the image lingered, vivid, almost tangible. He could recall every detail, the strange angle of the plane's descent, the sunlight glinting off its wings, even the faint reflection of something, maybe clouds, maybe faces, in the windows before the moment of impact. His wife, Laura, stirred beside him. "Mike? What is it?" she murmured, still half asleep. He hesitated. How could he explain something that felt so real yet so impossible? "Just a bad dream," he whispered. "Go back to sleep." But he didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, Michael sat in his office, staring blankly at a stack of paperwork he couldn't bring himself to touch. The dream hovered behind his eyes, like a shadow that refused to fade. He tried to drown it in routine, coffee, phone calls, polite smiles, but the image always returned. When the day finally ended, he drove home in silence, feeling the first stirrings of dread for something he couldn't name. That night, it happened again. The same dream. The same field. The same plane. But this time, the moment before impact stretched longer, as if time itself resisted what was coming. He saw the plane tilt, right wing up, nose dipping, then roll completely upside down. There was still no sound. And then the flash again. When he woke, he was crying. Laura sat up beside him, frightened. "Michael, what's happening? You're scaring me." He buried his face in his hands. "It's the same dream. The same damn dream." She took his hand gently. "It's just stress. You've been working too much." But even as she said it, her voice wavered. She could see in his eyes that this wasn't an ordinary nightmare. By the fourth night, Michael dreaded sleep. He lay awake until exhaustion dragged him under, only to find himself standing again in that same open field, the air too still, the horizon too bright. The plane always came from the same direction, low, silent, inevitable. Each time, the terror grew more real, more visceral. He could almost feel the heat of the explosion on his skin. He began to notice small details changing. A number on the tail. A logo on the fuselage that looked hauntingly familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. Once, he thought he saw people through the plane's windows, faces pale and expressionless, staring straight ahead as though they, too, were trapped in a dream. When he woke that time, his hands were shaking uncontrollably. On the sixth morning, Laura found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring into an untouched cup of coffee. "I can't keep doing this," he said quietly. "It's not a dream anymore. It feels like a warning." She frowned. "A warning about what?" "I don't know." He rubbed his eyes, exhausted. "But every time I close my eyes, it's closer. I can feel it." He tried to convince himself it was nothing, just a mind under pressure, inventing patterns where there were none. But the logical part of him was losing the battle. Something about the dream felt too precise, too consistent. That day, during his lunch break, he called the local aviation office. He didn't even know why. When a receptionist transferred him to a regional manager named Paul Henders, Michael hesitated, then said, "This is going to sound strange, but I think something bad is going to happen." "To a plane." There was a pause on the other end. "Sir, are you reporting a threat?" "No. It's not that. It's something I've seen. In a dream." Another pause. The man's tone softened. "A dream?" "Yes. The same one, every night for a week. It's a passenger jet. It crashes. I can see it like it's right in front of me." Henders sighed quietly. "Do you know the airline? The flight number? Anything specific?" Michael hesitated. "It has 3 engines. One on each wing, one on the tail. It might be." He struggled to recall the faint logo. "It might be Northern Airlines. Or something similar." The man promised to make a note of it, though Michael could hear in his voice that he didn't believe a word. That night, Michael dreamed again. But something had changed. The field was gone. Instead, he was standing on a runway. The air smelled of fuel and heat. The plane rolled past him, enormous, trembling as if alive. Its engines screamed, the first sound he'd ever heard in the dream, and as it lifted off the ground, he knew, with absolute certainty, that it wouldn't stay in the air for long. When it began to roll to one side, he screamed, not in fear, but in recognition. He woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. For the first time, he wasn't just afraid of the dream. He was afraid of what would happen when it stopped. For 2 nights afterward, Michael didn't sleep at all. He tried, he really did, but each time he closed his eyes, he felt the pulse of turbine somewhere behind his eyelids, the echo of that impossible silence that always came before the fire. Coffee became his only companion. The television murmured lone news reports about politics, sports, everything ordinary, yet each word sounded distant, like a language from a world he was no longer part of. By Friday morning, his coworkers noticed. The normally calm office manager now looked pale and brittle, like glass ready to crack. When his secretary asked if he was feeling all right, Michael smiled in a way that wasn't really a smile and said he just hadn't been sleeping well. He left work early. Outside, the sky hung heavy and colorless, the kind of sky that feels like waiting. Michael parked his car in front of a small diner on the edge of town and sat there, engine off, hands gripping the wheel. The same number kept circling in his mind, 191. He didn't know where it came from. He'd woken that morning with it echoing inside him, as though someone had whispered it directly into his ear. When he finally went inside, the waitress poured him coffee and asked if he wanted pie. He shook his head, distracted. On the counter beside the cash register sat a stack of newspapers. The headline of one caught his eye, "Northern Airlines expands fleet, new jet takes off next week. 3 engines. The same model he'd seen in his dreams. Michael's mouth went dry. He read the article twice, then again. The airline was based in Chicago. The first flight of the new jet, Flight 191, was scheduled for the following week. His hands began to tremble. That evening he phoned the FAA office again. This time, his voice carried a quiver that made the receptionist pause before transferring him. When Paul Henders came on the line, Michael said, "I found something. The flight, it might be real." Henders listened without interrupting. When Michael mentioned the number 191, there was a long silence. "Mr. Reed," Henders finally said, careful and professional, "we investigate reports based on verifiable information, maintenance issues, threats, malfunctions. We can't ground an aircraft because someone dreamed about it." "I'm not asking you to ground it," Michael replied. I need you to check it. Please. Something's wrong with that plane. I can feel it." "I'll see what I can do," Henders said, though they both knew he wouldn't. When Michael hung up, he stared at the phone as if it might ring again and tell him everything was fine. It didn't. That night, exhaustion finally overpowered fear. He fell asleep in the armchair beside the window. This time the dream began differently. He wasn't on the ground anymore, he was inside the plane. The cabin was full, every seat occupied. Sunlight streamed through the windows, painting faces in gold and shadow. The passengers spoke softly, their words blending into the hum of engines. Then, one by one, they turned their heads toward him. Every face, every pair of eyes fixed on Michael. No one blinked. He wanted to scream, but his throat was locked. The plane began to shudder. A stewardess stumbled past, her smile gone rigid. Oxygen masks dropped like pale fruit from the ceiling. Someone shouted something he couldn't hear. The cabin tilted, first a gentle lean, then a violent roll. Luggage burst from the overhead bins. A baby cried. Michael felt the pull of gravity drag him sideways. Through the window he saw the wing twist, the engine tearing away from the mount like an arm ripped from its socket. Fire licked the fuselage. The plane was upside down now. The earth rushed toward them. He covered his face, and woke up screaming. Laura ran from the bedroom, terrified. Michael. He couldn't speak. Tears streamed down his cheeks, his chest ached as if he'd fallen with them. When he finally found his voice, it came out hoarse. "It's going to happen, Laura. That flight. Next week. Chicago. I saw it. It's not just a dream," he shouted. "It's a warning." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. The following days blurred into one another. Michael stopped going to work. He barely ate. He spent hours reading aviation reports, searching for any mention of the new DC-10, like jet Northern Airlines was preparing to fly. He found technical diagrams, maintenance schedules, even photographs. Each image filled him with a nauseating recognition. He tried again to reach Henders, but the man was unavailable. When he finally left a message, his voice was barely steady. "If anything happens to that plane, it'll be on your conscience too." He regretted the words immediately, but he also meant them. 3 nights before the scheduled flight, Michael dreamed again. He was standing on the runway in Chicago. The morning air was pale and sharp. The jet stood before him, gleaming under the sun like something sacred and doomed. The number 191 was printed in bold red across the nose. A mechanic waved from near the landing gear. Michael opened his mouth to warn him, but no sound came out. The engine started, a deafening roar. The plane began to roll forward. Michael ran after it, shouting silently, until the heat from the exhaust forced him back. He watched as it lifted off, wheels folding beneath the body, climbing higher, higher. Then one of the engines tore away, spinning through the air like a comet. The plane tilted. It turned over. The world vanished in light. When Michael awoke, the morning sun had barely touched the blinds. He sat motionless for a long time, feeling as though he'd returned from somewhere far beyond the reach of language. That day, he wrote a letter. He addressed it to the Federal Aviation Administration, attention to anyone who might listen. He described the dreams, the number, the details of the crash. At the bottom he wrote one last sentence: "If nothing happens, I'll gladly be wrong." He mailed it and waited. 2 days passed. No response. On the morning of May 25th, the television flickered quietly in the background as Michael sat with a cup of coffee he didn't drink. Laura hovered near the kitchen door, watching him with the helplessness of someone standing beside a slow-moving disaster. At 3 p.m., the broadcast changed. The anchor's voice shifted mid-sentence. A breaking news banner crawled across the bottom of the screen. Michael didn't need to hear the words. He already knew. Northern Airlines Flight 191 has crashed shortly after takeoff from Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. The cup slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. All passengers and crew are feared dead. The room tilted, just as the plane had. Laura's voice came from somewhere distant, but Michael couldn't answer. The world had narrowed to a single sound, the faint echo of an explosion that no one else could hear. That night he sat alone in the dark, unable to move, unable to cry. He replayed every conversation, every ignored warning. He pressed his palms against his eyes until he saw sparks of color. Behind them, the plane still burned. When sleep finally came, it was mercifully dreamless. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the sky inside his mind was silent. But the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like something waiting. The days that followed the crash felt unreal, as though the world itself had slipped slightly off its axis. Sirens and news helicopters filled the air over Chicago. The television showed twisted metal scattered across a field, smoke still rising hours after impact. Every channel spoke the same numbers: 273 dead, 0 survivors. To everyone else, it was a national tragedy. To Michael Reed, it was confirmation of his own damnation. He couldn't tear his eyes from the screen. Every few minutes a reporter repeated details that matched his dreams exactly: the wing that tore loose, the inverted roll, the sudden explosion. Each repetition drove the image deeper into him until he could no longer tell whether he was remembering the news or reliving the dream. Laura tried to turn off the television, but he stopped her with a quiet, desperate shake of his head. "If I stop watching," he whispered, "it'll happen again somewhere else." That night, he sat at the kitchen table with the lights off. The house was silent except for the refrigerator's soft hum and the ticking clock that seemed louder with every second. He replayed his conversations with Henders, the letter he had mailed, the moment the receptionist had transferred his call. All of it now sounded absurd, like a man shouting warnings into a storm. The phone rang once, startling him. It was a journalist from the Cincinnati Chronicle. "We heard you contacted the FAA before the crash," the reporter said. "Can we meet?" Michael closed his eyes. He could already see the headline, "Man Dreamed Plane Crash Before It Happened." He almost hung up, but something inside him, the same compulsion that had made him write that letter, told him not to hide. "Tomorrow," he said. "Just once. After that, leave me alone." The reporter arrived the next afternoon, a young woman named Ellen Price, whose calm professionalism reminded him painfully of how sane people were supposed to sound. She recorded their conversation on a small tape deck. "Tell me about the first dream," she said. Michael hesitated. It wasn't just one. It was the same dream, over and over, for 10 nights. As he spoke, his voice gained a slow, terrible steadiness. He described the field, the silent descent, the faces at the windows. Ellen's pen stopped moving halfway through. "Do you think you could have stopped it?" she asked softly. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the exhaustion behind his eyes. "I tried," he said. "But no one listens when the message comes from a dream." When she left, she thanked him and promised to handle the story respectfully. By noon, reporters were camped outside his house. Camera flashes lit the windows like lightning. Neighbors whispered on the sidewalk. Laura pleaded with him to go stay somewhere else, but Michael refused. He felt chained to the story, as though abandoning it would make the dream start again. A week later, a black government sedan stopped in front of his house. 2 men in dark suits introduced themselves as representatives from the National Transportation Safety Board. They spoke politely, but their questions were precise. What exactly had he seen? When had he seen it? Had anyone else told him details before the crash? "I didn't need details," Michael said. "I saw it happen before it did." They exchanged a glance that was not unkind but full of professional doubt. When they left, one of them said quietly, "If you have any more dreams, Mr. Reed, let us know." The sentence carried a shade of irony he couldn't ignore. That night he dreamt of nothing at all. Weeks turned into months. The world moved on. Flight 191 became a number in a history book, another black and white photo filed among disasters that people mention for a while and then forget. But Michael didn't forget. He began walking at night through the sleeping neighborhoods, searching the sky for blinking lights. Each passing jet made him flinch. Sometimes he imagined he could still hear the unearthly silence from his dream between the roar of engines. Laura tried to pull him back, therapy, medication, time away, but he couldn't explain to her that the fear was no longer about the crash. It was about what had spoken through him. He started keeping a journal, every dream, every flicker of déjà vu. Some entries were only fragments. Red sky, engines turning backward. Voice in static says, "Not finished." The handwriting grew more frantic with each page. One rainy evening, months after the crash, a letter arrived from the FAA. It was brief, an official acknowledgement of his previous correspondence, a polite statement that the agency had reviewed his concerns, but could find no actionable evidence. At the bottom, a final line, "We appreciate your vigilance." He read it once, then tore it in half. Vigilance. What good was vigilance when the warning came too late? That night, he dreamed again. He was standing in his backyard. The sky above was filled with planes, Hundreds of them, silver shapes crossing each other like insects trapped in glass. Each one carried the number 191 on its tail. He raised his hands and shouted, but no sound left his throat. The planes began to fall all at once, folding into the horizon like dying stars. When he woke, the window was open, and the air smelled faintly of jet fuel. Of course, it was only his imagination. Of course. Ellen Price returned months later, her voice cautious on the phone. She said she was working on a follow-up piece, something more reflective. Michael agreed to meet her at a quiet cafe near the river. "You look different," she said when she saw him. "Thinner." He smiled faintly. "Haven't been sleeping much." They talked for an hour. Ellen asked what he thought the dreams really meant. Michael stirred his coffee, watching the swirl of cream form tiny spirals. "I used to think they were warnings," he said. "Now I'm not sure. Maybe they're echoes, like the future trying to remember itself." She frowned. "That sounds fatalistic. Maybe fate is just memory that hasn't happened yet." Ellen didn't know what to say. When she finally asked if he still dreamed about planes, he looked out the window. A jet passed high above the clouds, its sound fading into the distance. "Sometimes," he said quietly. "But now they're not crashing. They're waiting." That was the last interview he ever gave. Ellen's article ran under the title Echoes of Flight 191. It was sympathetic, even poetic, but by then public fascination had waned. Michael Reed slipped from the headlines as quietly as he had entered them. He and Laura sold the house the following year and moved north, closer to her family. Neighbors there knew nothing of his story, and for a time he managed to pretend it had happened to someone else. But each night, when the wind carried the faint rumble of passing aircraft, he found himself standing by the window, watching the sky with the wary reverence of a man who has glimpsed something he was never meant to see. In the end, the dreams never returned, not in full. Yet sometimes, just before dawn, he would half-wake to the feeling of being lifted, weightless, as though caught in an invisible ascent. He would hear the hum of engines deep within the earth, or maybe within himself, and for a moment he wouldn't know whether he was rising or falling. He never told Laura about those moments. He simply held her a little closer until the feeling passed. Years later, after Michael's death, Laura found his journals packed in an old wooden chest. Most pages were illegible, water-stained and trembling with panic. But on the final page, dated the week before he died, one entry stood alone, written in neat, steady handwriting. "The dream ended long ago, but sometimes I think it was never mine. Maybe dreams choose us the way storms choose a sky." For almost 10 years after Michael's death, Laura Reed avoided everything that flew. She drove instead of taking planes, even for the longest trips. Whenever friends asked why, she only said she preferred to see the country from the ground. What she didn't say was that every time she heard a jet climbing overhead, her heart gave the same small, frightened jump it had the morning the news announced Flight 191. Michael had died quietly in his sleep. The doctor said his heart had simply stopped, no pain, no warning. Laura had found him at dawn, the window open, the curtain moving in a slow rhythm, as if the house itself were breathing. For a long time she sat beside him, holding the still warm hand that had so often shaken with fear. He looked peaceful at last, almost relieved. After the funeral, she packed the journals away. She told herself she would never read them. But grief has a strange gravity, it pulls you toward the very thing that hurts to touch. One winter evening she opened the chest. Inside were notebooks stacked in uneven piles, some stained, some half-burned from the candle wax he used when he couldn't stand electric light. At first she read cautiously, a few pages at a time. The entries were feverish but heartbreakingly lucid. Michael had documented everything, the dreams, the calls, the disbelief, the way the world had turned its back after the crash. Then she reached the last notebook, the one dated only March 1989. The handwriting was smaller, steadier. It no longer sounded like a confession but like field notes from someone mapping a terrain that no longer existed. Laura closed the book, unsettled. She had never believed in omens or prophecy. And yet, reading those words, she felt an odd, almost physical awareness that the world around her, this kitchen, this chair, this cup cooling beside her, was thinner than she had ever realized. In the years that followed, she built a life from fragments. A teaching job. A small apartment near the river. New friends who never asked too much about the past. She even began to sleep through the night again. Until one spring morning. She was grading papers at the window when a faint vibration passed through the glass. At first she thought it was a truck on the street below. Then she heard it. A deep, rhythmic hum that grew and faded like a heartbeat. She looked up. A plane crossed the sky, gleaming silver in the sunlight. Perfectly ordinary. But as it tilted slightly in the wind, a flash caught her eye, just a reflection, she told herself, yet for an instant it formed a number across the fuselage. She could have sworn it read 191. Her pulse stuttered. The hum faded. The plane disappeared into the blue. She laughed then, quietly, nervously, at her own foolishness. But that night, when she turned off the lamp, she left the curtains open. The first dream came a week later. She was walking across a wide, empty field under a washed-out sky. The air smelled of rain and kerosene. In the distance, a low rumble deepened until it became the whine of engines. A plane approached, descending silently, wings glinting. For a moment she thought it was going to crash, then it leveled out, skimming just above her head. Through the windows she saw faces. Hundreds of them. And in the co-pilot seat sat Michael, calm, almost serene, looking straight ahead. When the plane passed, the wind lifted her hair, and a single scrap of paper fluttered to the ground at her feet. On it, in Michael's handwriting, were 4 words, "It's not over yet." She woke gasping, heart hammering against her ribs. The clock read 4:16 a.m., the exact time he had woken from his first nightmare all those years ago. The dreams continued, not nightly but often enough to unsettle her. Each time, Michael appeared farther from the ground, first in the cockpit, then in the clouds, then fading into a brightness she couldn't bear to look at. It wasn't frightening anymore, it was intimate, almost tender, like a conversation carried out in another language. She began writing them down in the back pages of his old journal. Unlike Michael's frantic scrawl, her entries were calm, deliberate. He doesn't fall anymore. He rises until he disappears. Maybe that's what the dream was trying to learn all along, how to end without ending. Years slipped by. Airlines changed their names, planes grew quieter, smoother. The story of Flight 191 became a paragraph in a museum display, a grainy photograph behind glass. Sometimes visitors left flowers, though most just walked past. One evening, Near the anniversary of the crash, Laura visited the memorial outside Chicago. The air was warm, the sky bruised with sunset. She traced the engraved names with her fingertips until she reached Michael Reed, his inclusion the result of a clerical error that had never been corrected. His letter to the FAA had made him part of the file. She didn't ask them to fix it. It felt right, somehow, that his name stood among those he had tried to save. As she turned to leave, a sudden gust lifted the leaves around her. For a moment she thought she heard the faint hum of engines overhead, though the sky was empty. She smiled, not in fear, but in recognition. That night, the final dream came. She found herself inside a plane, the cabin bathed in soft light. There was no sound of engines, no sense of movement. Passengers sat quietly, faces calm, as if waiting for something gentle to happen. Michael stood in the aisle, dressed as he had been in life, tie slightly loosened, eyes steady and kind. He smiled. "You heard it too," he said. "What is it?" she asked. "The echo," he replied. It was never about the crash. It was the echo that wanted to be heard. The plane began to fill with light, not blinding but endless. Michael reached out his hand. Laura hesitated, then took it. The light grew brighter, until the cabin dissolved into sky. When neighbors found her the next morning, she was sitting in the armchair by the window, peaceful, eyes closed. The radio beside her was still playing softly, a news segment about renewed interest in precognitive phenomena and dream studies connected to historical aviation disasters. The announcer's voice faded beneath a low, steady hum that might have been static, or perhaps the sound of distant engines climbing into the air. On the table lay an open notebook. Across the last blank page were 4 words written in a firm, familiar hand. "It's over." It began. Researchers who later examined the Reeds' correspondence found no concrete proof that Michael's dreams contained verifiable information before the crash. Skeptics called it coincidence, confirmation bias, survivor's guilt writ large. Believers called it evidence that consciousness, in moments of extreme tension, can reach forward and backward through time. But among the personal effects preserved in an archive box at the Ohio Historical Society, one item remains unexplained. A sheet torn from Michael's first notebook, its edges singed. The handwriting is faint but legible. At the top corner, in pencil, someone, perhaps Laura, has written a single notation, filed April 16, 1979. The words beneath read: "When the dream finally ends, the silence will sound like flight."